As gaming has evolved over the years, developers have all conformed to a very similar control setup. This helps us as users easily identify control schemes and switch between games without having to adjust too much. It's something we take for granted these days. This modern control configuration took years to develop. I want to find out where it came from. What were the first games to use these control setups? What pioneered these configurations? 2D games had it easy because there were only two axes of movement, up and down and left and right. Once we found ourselves in the 3D era, developers had to figure out how to control a whole nother two axes, that being the player's perspective. The answer sounds easy now, just add another analog stick. But back then, this seemed super complex. Were users going to be able to easily pick this up and figure it out? It adds a slight learning curve that most of us don't realize now because we've been playing these types of games since we were kids. Instead of constantly moving one thumb to control direction, you're now constantly moving two. This idea could be traced way back to 1981 with the arcade game Space Dungeon, a twin-stick shooter. 1 year later, Robotron 2084 used the same control scheme, popularizing it. The same guy who made Robotron, Eugene Jarvis, went on to make Smash TV in 1990, which uses the same dual analog control setup in the arcade. On the NES version, by default, you just have the directional pad and A button to shoot in whichever direction you're pointing in. However, if you use two NES controllers, you can use one D-pad to control the direction of movement and one to control the direction you're shooting in. If you have an NES 4 score, you can plug in 4 controllers to have 2 players using this control scheme. A year prior to the release of Smash TV, Sega released this horrific controller for the Sega Mega Drive with a thumbstick and a slider. This is a very primitive version of dual analog. The right thumb slider is intended to control throttle in a game like Afterburner 2. So, not exactly the 4 axes of movement we're looking for. This is more like 3. It wasn't until 1996 when Sony released the dual analog flight stick, which featured 2 joysticks, one for each hand. This was used with the game Descent, a game where you control a spacecraft with 4 axes of movement. We're getting pretty close to modern 3D controls here. At the time, this game was the future, if you had one of those giant expensive flight sticks, which nobody did. So moving on. Also in 1996, the N64 was released. This only had one joystick, but it did have a C-pad on the right side and a D-pad on the left side. This was no doubt intended to be used to control the third and or fourth axes. But many developers didn't know what to do with it. Mario 64 had terrible camera controls, almost as if the controls were only there to fix the camera if it were stuck behind the geometry. But this was a good start. In 1997, Turok Dinosaur Hunter was released. This game used the C-pad to control movement and the thumbstick to look around. This is a good step in the right direction, but it's backwards from today's standards. A few months later, GoldenEye was released for the N64. By default, this game used the C-pad to look up and down and to strafe. So, in a weird sort of misguided development move, it swaps 2 of the axes. One thumbstick should control the movement of the character, and one should control the perspective. In this game, the left stick moves you forward and backwards and pivots your perspective, while the C-pad controls looking up and down and strafing. Totally weird to think about now. And if that wasn't enough, the left stick is also inverted. Everything's all f***ed up here. There is a little known control scheme buried deep in the options menu that allows you to plug in 2 N64 controllers and use one in each hand, just like Smash TV. And it featured a plethora of configurations so you can swap the axes into the correct layout. You just have to put controller 2 in your left hand and controller 1 in your right hand. But now we're getting somewhere with dual analog. Also in 1997, Sony released the dual analog controller, which was the first console controller ever to feature 2 analog sticks as we know it today. This was very quickly scrapped and updated a few months later to become the DualShock controller, featuring an L3 and R3 button hidden under each thumbstick and, of course, introducing rumble in North America and Europe. This controller was so good that Sony has barely changed the design 4 generations later. However, again, developers didn't know what to do with this thing. The first game to require the DualShock was Ape Escape in 1999, which was a 3D platformer. This was 2 years after the DualShock's release. The right stick wasn't used to control the camera though, it was used to control the player's neck. The same year, Quake 2 and the original Medal of Honor were released for the PlayStation 1, both with options to use the dual analog sticks. Perhaps the first game to have the dual analog sticks mapped in a modern way by default was Alien Resurrection, released in 2000. But this was actually a step back for us. The controls were really janky, and the game was critically panned because of those janky controls. One GameSpot review read, "The game's control setup is its most terrifying element. The left analog stick moves you forward, back, and strafes right and left, while the right analog stick turns you and can be used to look up and down." From here, the timeline splits. First-person and third-person games will go on to have their own unique control styles. And that is why this is only part 1 of the series. So thank you guys so much for watching. I've been really interested in this ever since I made my video defending Sonic Adventure 2, when I was trying to figure out what the first game was to have the right stick control the camera movement in a 3D platformer. And then that led me down this road to try to figure out what games did it at all first. 3D platformer or first-person shooter regardless. So if enough of you like this video, I will make one talking about the control schemes of first-person shooters, and I'll make one on 3D platformers. To my knowledge, the first 3D platformer to have a free-look rotating camera was Mario Sunshine, believe it or not. And that blows my mind because that came out pretty damn late, that game. So anyway, give me your thoughts on this video. Leave in the comments below. I'm on Twitter, all this other social media garbage. Let me know if you like the format. Let me know if you want to see more. Thank you guys very much. Have a good week. Now, personally, I've only played a few hours of the first Mass Effect, and she's not even in that. But looking at some of the footage and pictures and whatnot, it's undeniable that this certainly is a butt. There can't be a Jedi Order in this, or else Kylo Ren would be annihilated in a second.
That and the fact that, you know, according to Rey, it's all myths and legends.
Right.
Like, there have been no Jedi.
I think it's cool if there's not a lot of Jedi still.